All right, so we're live with 52 weeks of AWS. Had a break last week. We're back continuing to cover the AWS Solutions Architect certification material. And up next here is how to automate your architecture. Really one of my favorite topics, automating things, making sure that things aren't broken. If they're not automated, in my opinion, they're broken. So let's get right into it. And I'm going to share my screen here and get started. And in particular, what I can do is, start off with talking a little bit about what we're going to cover. And so, in a nutshell, we're going to talk about, why is it such a big deal to automate, and why is it so important? Well, in particular, a long manual process to build an architecture can really involve lots of different steps. So, some of the things you want to think about are, where do you want to put your efforts into the designing and implementing cloud computing? Could you update production servers? How would you actually do this? How will you debug deployments? What happens with the dependencies for your system if you deploy the wrong thing? Also, is it realistic that you can do all these things manually? So in some cases, a lack of automation will actually stop you from being able to deploy software reliably. So the risks for manual deployment are that you don't have a repeatable state at scale. And this is really an issue in terms of reliability. So it's not that it's a nice to have, it's a must have if you're at a certain scale. You also don't have version control. Things are manual. So what if there is a catastrophic failure? Would it be an existential threat to your organization? Also, lack of audit trails. So how do you know that things are actually compliant? Let's say you are working with the military or the government or healthcare or finance, and there's some kind of audit trail. Are you sure you could actually go back in time and do that? And finally, consistency. If you don't have consistent data, you're going to have issues in terms of automation. So these are all some of the problems with manual processes. And I've experienced all of these in different companies, startups in the Bay Area, the film industry, is that many people think you don't need automation, but it turns out you do, and you can cause serious threats to your company's existence. So how would you actually fix this? Well, in terms of AWS, they have something called the AWS Well-Architected Framework Principle, and there's operational excellence design principles. So what this means is that you perform operations as code. So I think this is a big takeaway, is if your organization isn't performing things as code, that's an issue. Another one is make frequent small reversible changes. So I remember I was working at a virtual reality company in the Bay Area, one of the first ever. Probably won't be too hard to find out who that is. And they had changes where web services would be updated once per week. And that was a big conflict I had with the operations team, because I wanted to make changes multiple times per day. And I guess their history was doing C++, changes. But in reality, you're actually causing, real issues with cloud computing and modern DevOps by not allowing people to make frequent, small, reversible changes. I know there's a huge dust up at some point where people were really upset. That I wanted to make frequent, small, reversible changes. So sometimes even doing the right thing can cause conflicts, but it doesn't mean you don't need to stick to your guns. The reliability pillar design principle is to manage change in automation. And really, these are some of the ideas that are important to remember in complying with AWS's view of the world. So how do we do it? Let's go ahead and talk about it. In general, with AWS, probably one of the more straightforward ones to automate is with a service called AWS Cloud Formation. And this provides a simplified way to model, create, and manage a collection of AWS resources. And so they come up inside of a stack. You don't have to pay for Cloud Formation. And actually, it comes with a lot of the automation tasks, and you can go ahead and see what actually occurred. So you can create tasks, update them, and delete these stacks. And it enables you to have a predictable provisioning and updating of resources. And you can also version control the resource deployments. And there are also tools that are built on top of it, which one of the tools I use is something called AWS CDK, or Cloud Development Kit. So in a nutshell, how does it work? Well, you define your resources in a template, and you use that template or a pre-built template. You upload it to Cloud Formation or point it to a location in S3, and then you execute a stack creation action. And this is giving you the ability to create those resources across multiple services inside of an AWS account. So really, it's a whole inclusive operation that can involve many services. This stack retains control of the resources. You can later update stack, detect drift, or delete the stack. So infrastructure as code is another word for this. And for AWS, the built-in choice for infrastructure as code is AWS Cloud Formation. So there's a lot of startups, that do infrastructure as code, and sure, those can be interesting. My real critique of some of these startups that do infrastructure as code, even ones that are publicly traded, is that the issue is, if you want to master your particular cloud and you're not necessarily trying to create a hybrid solution, it may be more work than it's worth. And so I lean towards using the tools that are available for the cloud that I'm on. That's why I'm less of a fan of these kind of cross-platform tools, because now I have to use two tools at the same time, right? I don't want to use a tool that talks to another tool. I'd rather talk to the tool that does the work. In this case, the AWS Cloud already has infrastructure as code. Once it's deployed, you can actually replicate it, redeploy it, repurpose it, and it's also human readable and machine consumable. So that's another nice thing about having infrastructure as code. So some of the benefits, you can reduce multiple matching environments. You can have consistency. You can clean things up, right? Because you have a history of what it is you created. So now you can actually undo it. So really the benefits are reusability, repeatability, maintainability. These are some of the benefits of infrastructure as code. So the AWS Cloud Formation template syntax is a little bit verbose, but it is readable. And you can actually write it in either JavaScript, or you can write it in YAML. The advantages of YAML is it's actually a little more concise than JSON, and it supports embedded comments. JSON is a little more widely used in terms of APIs. And so the recommendation is treat the templates like source code and put these into a source code repository. Now, the templates can be authored in the AWS Cloud Formation Designer, which is a graphical design interface in the AWS Management Console. So here's a good example of create an EC2 instance. You would have parameters, and this is where you would specify what values can be set at runtime. You would have resources. This is the resources that you're going to refer to in your CloudFormation template, like, for example, an AMI or an instance type. And then the output are the things that are going to be returned when it's created. So, for example, the instance ID is unknown until you create it. So you would maybe return that back out. CloudFormation in general, you can use the same template for both production and deployment. And this is really awesome because when you're doing development, a lot of times it can get a drift where your development environment and your production environment are different, or your production database, your staging database are different. And so this allows you to actually have the same configuration for all the environments because it's templated out. And this is a huge advantage of infrastructure as code. The AWS CloudFormation change sets as well allow you to preview the changes. So not only do you have this great ability to reuse it, but you can actually preview these changes, and you can actually make sure that you are going to do the thing you want to do when you update the stack. Now, drift detection is a really critical component of infrastructure as code with CloudFormation. And what this does is it shows you when something is actually been modified so that you can choose what to do in that particular situation. And in terms of scoping and organizing the templates, you could have, for example, different kinds of templates for different services like web interfaces, backend services for search, payments, shared services like a subnet or security group, network, for VPCs, and security would be things like users, groups, and roles. Now, what if you want to get a quick start? Fortunately, AWS has quick starts available as AWS Cloud Formation templates. These are built by the AWS solutions architects and partners to help you deploy these solutions onto AWS. And these reference deployments can be provisioned in just maybe under an hour, but also even under a few minutes. And they help you build a well-architected test or production environment. So I think it's always a very good idea to go to the official documentation for AWS. Like in this case, look at their quick start, make sure that you see what a gold standard is. I'm a huge fan of doing what I'm told in terms of following the guides from a platform that I'm using. So in the case of this quick start here, you can see that you could go through and customize the deployment to match your needs and create a stack. Even if you don't use a quick start, you may find it helpful. Just look at it, right? Look at the patterns, look at the practices. I think it would be invaluable for you in order to, really become an expert on CloudFormation. You also can look at Marketplace Amazon Machine Images as another solution as well to get some ideas about how to build things out. So in general, in terms of cloud formation, I guess the big takeaway is that you can go to this in the console and take a look at it and play around with it yourself. Okay, so next up here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about automated deployments. And so a good example of something you'd want to automate is, how would you automate a fleet of EC2 instances? Maybe you have hundreds of instances to manage, like Linux, clusters or something like that. What would you do? And so in the case of hundreds or thousands of servers, sometimes a traditional tool maybe could be a way to handle this problem. Okay, let's go ahead and take a look here at operational insights inside of the AWS resources. One of the things you can do is you can use the AWS Systems Manager here to automate operational tasks. So, apply patches, software upgrades, and this is really a nice feature here to be able to use. Also, there's resources and application management that can be done with the Systems Manager, and you can also manage servers on-prem and in the cloud. Right? These are great use cases for the Systems Manager. And in particular, the Systems Manager capabilities allows you to do things like, update, manage, config. And in particular, this is a great tool actually, right? Because you can actually do this fleet kind of management, do patches, look at the inventory. These kind of systems management tools are really helpful when you're managing things at scale. It's really, in some sense, not even possible to do it without a tool like this systems management capability. These kinds of tools have been around for actually decades, and I've used many of them in different flavors, but this is really a nice tool that's integrated with AWS. The AWS Cloud Formation and Systems Manager are really complementary towards each other. And so in the case of Cloud Formation, right, it's the infrastructure itself, but then Systems Manager will hook into there as well. AWS Opsworks is a configuration management service that I've actually used for several years at multiple companies. And it was a Chef instance of AWS Opsworks that I used. And so this is a pretty neat tool, because if you want to do configuration using like a Ruby-like language, this definitely works pretty well. And I've actually used that in the past very well. And I think there's some advantages to using Opsworks. The disadvantage potentially, in my opinion, with Opsworks is a little bit slow versus other strategies. But if you're already familiar with Chef or Puppet, it's a good solution. And I've used both at different companies. So in the case of Opsworks, you would model your application as a stack that consists of layers, like a load balancing layer, application layer, RDS layer, and you would go through and build out your stack and deploy it. And in this particular scenario here, we have these two different technologies that are complementary. So you could use the AWS Cloud Formation template to create a resource, including a VPC. And then you could use another Cloud Formation template to create an Opsworks stack that will then be deployed into that particular VPC. So you can see how that all gets laid out there in general. Now, the next thing I'll talk about real briefly is Elastic Beanstalk, which is a little bit long in the tooth. It's been around for a long time, but it still has some life in it. Some of the problems with managing infrastructure is that application deployment is difficult, it's time consuming, you have a lack of consistency. And so one of the ways you can solve this is by using platform as a service offerings. And in particular, the AWS Elastic Beanstalk is one of them. And so if you do need to just deploy a front end somewhere, that runs Java or runs some kind of service, this can communicate directly with it, and it works pretty well. It has great command line tools integration, very good console ability. You can look at health monitoring, auto scaling. So really, it manages a lot of the things that are not fun to manage when you're deploying application. I've used it with Python, Java. You can also use, I think Node as well is supported. And I believe also .NET is supported as well. So AWS Elastic Beanstalk deployments, you can, really, I guess I just mentioned this: Java, .NET, PHP, Node, Python, Ruby, Go, Docker. I've used most of those except for PHP. And you upload your code, and then it basically deploys it automatically for you, which is really, really helpful. And in terms of what it looks like, you would have basically your application .elasticbeanstalk.com. And then in that particular scenario, you could have completely transparent use cases for everything that you're doing, including the availability zones, the application server you're using, the connection to the RDS. So really, I think the purpose of a platform as a service is just saves you time. If this fits the problem you're solving and you need a web server, I think it's a great resource to use. So why would you want to choose this versus another solution? There's lots of different services, but for example, for convenience, you can't beat something like Elastic Beanstalk, right? Because it's platform as a service. Opsworks is a lot more high level. And again, I've used it in the past where you have very small changes to things and it'll deploy configurations. These are high-level services. The more infrastructure as code or do-it-yourself side of things would be AWS Cloud Formation or even just EC2 raw. You could, for example, and I've done this, mount an Elastic file system volume to EC2 and then use user data and tell it to source some environment and then run a web server, right? So you can do all this yourself, but in many cases you don't want to do it. All right, so I think that's really it for the automation here that I was going to cover today. A couple other things I'll mention is that next week I'm going to be covering caching. So I'll see you next week for that. And I think I have a message here from Christopher at AWS, and he mentions that the AWS Cookbook, which we had reviewed in a previous live stream, is actually a good source. And that's true. There's a lot of great recipes in the AWS Cookbook. If you haven't had a chance to take a look at that, it's on the O'Reilly platform, or you can buy a copy on Amazon. It has lots and lots of recipes for doing things with cloud formation and automation. So take a look at that when you get a chance as well. All right. Well, thank you, everybody, and I will see you all next week.